Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. It's Wednesday, the 14th of February, 2024. I just wanted to do a few minutes on Steve Wright, who passed away yesterday. We're used to, over the last few years, certainly I've noticed that a lot of legendary figures from my lifetime, my youth, my adolescence, my so-called adulthood, have passed away. And it's life. It's life. People leave us. Steve Wright is one of those ones that has a big impact, really, because you suddenly realise what an important figure they were culturally and possibly personally. I'm a big radio fan. I listen to a lot of the radio. I listen to a lot of radio. If it's my companion during the day, if I'm writing, if I'm out and about, I've got the radio on. I've always got Radio 2 on. I used to be a Radio 1 boy. Of course, I've grown out of the music that they play now. Or, in fact, it's never grown into me, to be honest. So I'm a Radio 2 boy through and through, and I'm a big supporter of BBC Radio, national radio, and I think that Radio 2 has a nice, warm, inclusive feel about it, and they do have a way of selecting presenters who speak to you through the radio, and they become almost like friends in a strange way. You look forward to hearing from them. And that's never better exemplified than in the brilliant Steve Wright, who was a master radio innovator. And it's hard to believe that he's gone so suddenly. He was on the radio on Sunday on his Sunday Love Songs show on Radio 2, which is pre-recorded on the Friday. And I sometimes hear bits of that, and I did hear the end of this week's show where he said, I'll see you next week. And now he's gone. That's life, I suppose. That's the way it can be. Steve Wright, though, was a real talent, a real broadcaster, a real a disc jockey in the classic sense of somebody who was obsessed with radio and obsessed with music at a young age and was laser focused on getting a career in radio. And I don't think we get that so much these days with modern broadcasters. I don't think you get those people who are obsessed with the medium and obsessed with crafting it and doing something with it and innovating with it. You get people who go on the radio and do a show and play records, or have records played by production teams, or music rather than records. Steve Wright, though, was somebody who appreciated what this format could be, and he spent a lot of time working on a format that worked for him. He spent a lot of time in America listening to radio stations and being inspired by the innovations that were being shown in America. And he brought that back to Britain, where he launched what has become known as Zoo Radio, the afternoon posses and things like that, where he would have groups of people interacting and reacting with him and bouncing off him to create that feeling that you were at a party watching people having a good time. And it made you have a good time, made you feel better, listening to them laughing and making jokes, especially in times of crisis, in times when the world's not as good as you want it to be. Particularly, I'm thinking more recently of the pandemic, where everybody was trapped indoors and having a pretty rough time with it. And then you'd listen to somebody like Steve Wright, who would just lift your spirits, because he would be fooling around, cracking jokes and interviewing guests and just having fun with his team. And that's what he brought to British radio. He brought that sense of fun. He came to Radio 1 in 1980, I think it was, working in the Graham's Library, as they call it. And then he got his own show. He created Steve Wright in the Afternoon, which is where we saw this posse thing really flowering. He had a brief stint at breakfast time doing the famous breakfast show on Radio 1, which didn't really work out. He left that after a year. Then he moved over, and what tends to happen is that Radio 1 is in many ways a breeding ground for the later generation of disc jockeys whose music tastes may mature slightly as they mature, and they go over to Radio 2. But they bring what they've learnt onto Radio 2. This is what Steve Wright did. He adapted his afternoon format, recreated it as Steve Wright in the Afternoon, a show which ran for 23 years every afternoon, unless he was on holiday, of course, from 2 till 5, which was this cavalcade of fun, odds and sods, characters. I mean, he did lots of character comedy when he was on Radio 1, all these curated characters like Mr. Angry, Asking Elvis, all these things which he did. And he didn't do quite so much of that on Radio 2. I think he appreciated it was a slightly less zany audience. But he still had lots of comedy things and skits and voiceovers and impressions and so on. And it was just always good fun. And he got the best out of his guests as well, because his guests respected him and he researched them and he knew about them. And I listened to many of his interviews, and he would ask really intelligent questions. And he would sometimes get politicians on, and he would get to the core of what people were concerned about. And he developed these relationships with people who trusted him, because they knew that he wasn't there to make fools out of them or to undermine them in any way. He just wanted to have an interesting conversation, and maybe to get them to talk in ways they wouldn't normally talk when they're more guarded. And this was a format that ran and ran, and it was such a reliable part of the afternoon schedule on Radio 2. As I said, I'm a big Radio 2 fan. If I'm at home writing or working, I will generally be listening to Radio 2 during the day. If I'm out and about driving around, I'll have Radio 2 on, because a lot of people just listen to music. But I like that sort of feeling that a voice is there talking to you and that you're connecting with somebody, a human being, rather than just hearing the music. Steve Wright's career at Radio 2, of course, came to an end in, I think it was October 2022. BBC decided it was time for a change. I think Steve himself was quite sanguine about that, but I think he was secretly quite devastated to lose this little place on the schedule. And although his replacement, Scott Mills, has grown into the role, he's now quite entertaining. He's not Steve Wright. There is only one Steve Wright. And I think that Steve probably took that to heart. I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is responsible for his passing. We don't know what the reason is. It's obviously something quite sudden. But I think that it obviously had an effect on him losing that show. But I think it's unfair to say that he was axed by Radio 2. He wasn't. He was just moved aside. And it's understandable in a way. You've got a 67, 68-year-old man. Maybe it is time now and again to have a little bit of a shuffle and bring in some new faces and some new talent. But Steve Wright was still on Radio 2. He was doing lots of special shows. As I say, he did love songs. That was still very popular. Just last year, he took over the Pick the Pops show from Paul Gambaccini on Saturday afternoons. And what I've heard of it, he brought that same sense of fun and mischief to it, tempered a bit for a different show and a different audience. And last summer, he filled in for Joe Wiley in the evening from 7 till 9, doing a show, I think it was called Steve Wright's Summer Sounds, which was a really nice sort of laid-back, mellow show, playing music that was sort of perfect for a lot of lazy summer evenings, sort of that sort of music you can imagine people sipping a glass of wine out in the garden as the sun sets. Really nice, really good show, and I think he was having a good time with that, because I heard a couple of those and he sounded so chilled doing it. So yeah, he was an absolute legend. He will be missed, and I've been listening to a lot of stuff on the radio. Radio 2 is obviously doing a lot of stuff to celebrate him, but I don't think we should necessarily point the finger at Radio 2 and say, look what they did, because it's not their fault. Media has to move and has to change and adapt to the times. And whilst it was a shame that he lost his Radio 2 show, you have to think the bigger picture, I suppose. Radio 2 has to innovate and has to move forward. And I think it's unfair that certainly some newspapers have mouthed about the hypocrisy of the BBC in honouring him and mourning him when they took his show away from him. But they didn't take him away. They just found a different place for him. And I think as a 68-year-old man, you think he must have appreciated at some point having a less intense workload, because he worked very hard on his shows. He was constantly recording things and editing and researching things, his factoids, which he had on Radio 2. And I think there was a point in the last few years as well when he almost became a figure that people would parody, because he was a very old-fashioned sort of disc jockey in a way. And even calling him a disc jockey now, that in itself seems like an anachronistic term. But he was quite old-fashioned, and his Love the Show Steve, which a lot of his correspondents would end their messages to, became a bit of a joke. And I think that he became associated with the smashy and nicey sort of Paul Whitehouse and Harry Enfield thing. But it never dragged him down. It never made him change his style. His style was what it was. But I think now that he's passed, everybody's sort of realising what a brilliant communicator he was, what a brilliant broadcaster. He knew his music as well. He loved his music, and he would play certain songs that he was passionate about long after they were out of the charts and things. He would passionately support new artists and things, and he knew his music. He's a proper music fan, and I don't think you necessarily get that a lot of DJs these days. But I think unfortunately the BBC does do this. They now recruit their radio presenters from the world of television. They pick people who are popular on television. I'm not going to name the names, but you know the people who are on Radio 2 now. And they are there to bring what they have on television to the radio. I think that it's anticipated they will bring their popularity from TV onto the radio. And perhaps some of them do. But it's a different thing. They're bringing that version of themselves rather than a Steve Wright person who was a music and a radio fan. These people are taking what is a next step in their career to get them known. In a slightly cynical way, maybe? I don't know. But that's a whole other issue. So I do miss the days of people rising up through the ranks and becoming well known and appreciated and admired. And I admired Steve Wright. He was fantastic. He was a great entertainer. He didn't work on television so well. He did a show called Steve Wright's People Show, I think, and he presented Top of the Pops. But I think he did have the perfect face for radio, as they say, and that was his home, and that was where he was at his best. He will be missed, and and I think the fact that he's gone so suddenly as well really makes you think, wow, this time last week he was preparing to record his love song show, and now he's gone. So obviously our thoughts go to his family and his friends and everybody who worked with him. I never met him, I never knew him, but I feel as if I did, and that's what a good radio presenter does. So I just wanted to say a few words about the brilliant Steve Wright, who will be missed. Love the show, Steve.